right, so you all have gotten kind of a taste of decimals. Today we're going to move into geometry. Um, and we're going to move on from some parts of geometry that we think about. When you think of geometry, what do you think about? A lot of us think about just geometry as shapes, which it is. Geo as our prefix. What other words have the word geo in it, or the prefix geo in it? Yeah, geography is one. Geology is another. Geo is earth. And then what other words have you heard, like the metry part? Metry. Think about metric, like meters, the metric system. Meters, metric, measure, those are all from this kind of root word, which means measurement. So when we're talking about geometry, we're actually talking about how we measure the earth, or just kind of the things around us. And we've started off probably learning more about shapes, which we often see the world in different shapes. You can probably find this shape everywhere, or this shape everywhere, or this shape in some places. Nature even makes these types of shapes. And you may have even done it with your scavenger hunt last week. So let's talk about some of these shapes, and then we'll talk about the different vocab that we can use when we're talking about measuring some of these shapes. So what is this shape? Yeah, of course, it's a triangle. And how many sides does a triangle have? Yes, you got it, it has 3 sides. How many angles does a triangle have? I even said it to give you a hint. Triangle. We have 3 angles. Three angles. How many corners does a triangle have? It has 3 corners. How about this shape? What's this shape? Yep, it is a rectangle. These are all really basic things. How many sides does a rectangle have? Yep, 4 sides. How many angles? And we'll talk about why I just did square angles there to mark those angles. It has 4 angles. And 4 corners. What's this shape? Hexagon. Bees make natural hexagons. If you've ever seen columnar basalt, which is one of my favorite rock formations, those are natural hexagons. How many sides does it have? 6 sides. How many angles? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 angles, and 6 corners. All right, so we're going to go a little bit more in depth here. We're going to talk about those sides and what the different lines kind of mean, how we could measure those lines, talk about angles, and talk about measuring angles, and how we can compare different angles from one another. So let's dive in. Let's say I want to mark a space on this whiteboard. How would I mark that space, do you think? Some of you may have said I could put an X. X marks the spot. But am I talking about, what space am I talking about? Am I talking about like over here? Or over here maybe? Or over here? Usually with X marking the spot, we mark it right in the middle. So we can go even more precise here. We can even just put a dot. And that dot, for our vocab, we call a point. And I'm going to start writing down our vocab. A point. A point is an exact location in space, in the space around us. It's not necessarily in the atmosphere, sometimes it is, but it's just an exact location that we're talking about. So let's mark a number of different points. And we're trying to be as precise as possible. When we're talking about points, sometimes when we're talking about an exact location in space, we couldn't even see that with a microscope. So it's okay for us to be able to make it an actual dot that we can see so that we can talk about it in terms of mathematical language and terms. Now we have a bunch of points. Point to one of those points. Most likely, all of you pointed to a different point. So we need to mark these points with something specific so that when we're talking about them, we know exactly what we're talking about. Usually, points are marked with letters. And usually we do like to start off with, starting with A, kind of going up. We don't tend to go with a random letter, but sometimes you will see that it's marked with a random letter. And so you label those with letters. Now that we've got some points, let's go even further. I'm going to use a straight edge. I'm going to use a ruler to mark from one point to another point. I'm going to mark another point here. Oh, look at that straight line. I'm going to put those together. I'm going to move F just a little bit so that's on here. What did I just draw here? You may have said I drew some lines. Now, for geometry, we think about lines as going on forever and ever 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 in one whole line, and it never ever stops. It can go through walls, it can go through cement, it can go through paper. That line can go forever. We mark a line going forever and ever and ever with arrows. Now, that's great. We can mark, sometimes if we're talking about pointing to a specific line here, we still want to label it, and you'll notice that we still have points on these lines. So we can label these lines, these two lines, I drew two, with the points that are on that line. So for example, if we have this line with these 2 points, we can label this line AB, and then we can put a line with arrows going on both sides to show that it goes forever and ever and ever. For this line, we could do GE, oops, that looks like a 6, GE with 2 arrows. We could do GF with 2 arrows, FE with 2 arrows. We could do even EG, going in 2 different directions here with arrows. This just shows that those 2 lines, or those 2 points on the line, are on that line, and we can label it with that. But the most important part when talking about labeling lines is that we have 2 points that are on that line, and we have an arrow above it. So I'm going to say line, we mark it with 2 letters and an arrow. But what happens if we want to just talk about one specific spot on that line? Because lines can go forever. There would be an infinite amount of letters and letter combinations that we could have. And sometimes that's important to talk about, but sometimes we just want to talk about this really specific spot on that line. So let's say we just wanted to talk about here and here, from here to here. Or we have another one going from D to C, and we're just talking about that specific part from D to C. We call that a line segment. If you've ever heard the word segment before, sometimes you say that you saw a segment of a show. That means that you saw part of the show. So, same here, a segment is a part of a line. Now, if we mark a line with the 2 points on it and arrows at the top, how do you think we mark a line segment? You may have said we mark it with 2 dots at the end, which is totally doable, but sometimes when you're reading a book and it's talking about a line segment, say you're reading a textbook, it's going to be pretty small and it's going to be harder to see those dots. So in fact, a line segment is just going to have 1 line at the top with no arrows, no dots, no nothing. So if I am talking about from here to here, I'm going to label that line segment GF, or I could label it FG, because it kind of goes in, it doesn't have a specific direction. If I am talking about the line AB, then I can put those arrows. But if I am talking about this specific segment, I would label it AB with just a line. Notice the difference between those 2. So I'm going to put that there as our vocab. We've got line segment. Now, we do have something that kind of goes in between. We have talked about the whole line. We've talked about line segments. But what happens if you've got something that looks like this part over here where there's E and then it just keeps going and going and going? We've stopped at one point, but then that line just keeps on going from there, from that one point. Well, we call that a ray. A ray is part of a line with one end point, and we might call that point an end point because it's just that's the end of what we're talking about, and it keeps going in one direction. We call that a ray. So to mark a ray, we still kind of need 2 different spots. We can't just call this ray ray E because we're talking about E as the point. So we do need another point on this ray to mark. But remember, it will just keep going on and on and on. So let's see, I haven't said I. E-I. So we're talking from E to forever. We will mark that as E, I, and then 1 arrow. because it's going in one direction. Now, you might think that the arrow changes, like if I were to do I, E, and it's going from E to I, it would go in the opposite direction, but that is not the case. It's always going to go to the right, and that's just so that we have a common language between all of us, and that's totally okay, but we are going to go from right to left with our arrows for that, for our array. And so we are going to, I'm going to just mark A, B with an arrow, with one arrow there. So we've talked about points, lines that go forever, line segments, which are parts of the line, with two end points. They do have an end point to them. Rays, which have one endpoint and then go forever and ever and ever in the other one. We've talked about lines. What happens if these lines, let's clear up some of these things. We don't really need that. Don't need that for right now. Don't need that for right now. Since these two lines go forever and ever and ever, what's going to happen to them? At some point, they're going to do what we call intersecting. They're going to intersect. They're going to crisscross. Look at that. They crisscrossed. Now we get a little bit more deep into some geometry. If we crisscrossed a bunch of lines, they would turn into shapes, wouldn't they? Well, we need to talk about some of those intersecting lines, because sometimes they do turn into shapes if we're talking about segments. Sometimes they just keep going and going and going, and that's okay too, but we need to be able to talk about that. So when we have two lines that intersect, and actually I'll put that vocab down too, which means crisscross, the point where they cross, right here, has some vocab too. It is called our vertex. Our vertex. So sometimes on shapes, we talked really briefly about it, calling it a corner. But when two lines intersect or crisscross, we're going to now call that a vertex. So we might have two line segments from here to here, and from here to here, point to the vertex. Bingo, it's right there. Now let's go here to here, point to the vertex. I wasn't being specific enough. We need some labels. A, B, C, D, E, F. These are a bunch of line segments. Point to the vertex where C and line CD crosses and line AB crosses. Right there. You got it. Notice how I said that. Line CD. Oops. Oh my gosh. I gotta be a little bit more specific than that. Notice my vocab. Line segment CD crosses with line segment AB. That would be the vertex. You got it. So now, last but not least, we are going to talk about that space, or the measurement of space between two lines. We've got all sorts of different ones. These are called, that space between those two lines are called angles, or we might also call an angle a figure formed by two rays or two line segments or two lines. Usually we'll call them rays because this is going to be an end point and then they will keep going, and we have now formed an angle. We're going to be able to talk about that measurement between those two lines or line segments, but an angle is that figure that we just formed. So we formed an angle from these two lines, from this line till this line, and we kind of have a ray with our vertex. So we just formed an angle. So those are all of the different types of geometry vocabulary that we're going to be using right now. We're going to be talking about all sorts of different types of lines intersecting and angles, and talking about measuring angles in our next lesson. But for right now, I want you to get practice with drawing and labeling all of these different things. And actually, angles, I forgot to say how we measure angles. Angles, the way that we measure angles, if we have 2 points here, and this is marking this area and this is marking this area, we can call that an angle. And it kind of looks like a greater than symbol, but notice that it's flat on the bottom. And we can call that FD or DF, or something like that. Whatever the points are called at that point. Haha, at that point. So now, I want you to get practice with being able to draw all of these things, and then we'll talk about more about measuring angles next time.